The HX Collective explores the human experience through three main channels of life: work, relationships, and self. With raw, authentic conversations, the podcast investigates how challenges can become powerful teachers, leading to personal growth and deeper connections. Rooted in humanity-centered design, each episode reflects a commitment to doing good and doing well, featuring diverse voices and generational perspectives. Expect gripping stories of struggle and success, with thought-provoking discussions and concrete tools and tactics that encourage you to rethink your relationship with distress, helping you to establish your full human experience. This is the HX Collective channel. Hello, friends, and welcome to the next episode of the HX Collective podcast. I'm your host, Deb Knupp, and I am such a privilege having conversations with amazing people who are united with us in elevating the human experience and human flourishing. Today, we are in for such a treat. You know, in that time in your life where you are on a professional journey, you encounter special people that are just lit from within, and there's something so magnetic and so attractive about them that you're just drawn to them like a moth to a flame. Well, that is my personal experience with our guest today, Laura Gutierrez. Laura is one of the leading minds in our professional world in the land of legal marketing. She is a prolific writer, and she is such a fantastic thinker and change agent, and people gravitate to her because of her authenticity, her vulnerability, and her willingness to really connect with you at a human level. And so I'm so delighted, Laura, that we get to have this conversation today. We're going to talk about human flourishing really through the lens of what it means to see the human experience through work and so many of your work experiences. But we're also going to talk about that deeply human flourishing sense in our own selves and what you've experienced in your own journey and all the roles that you play as a friend, as a colleague, but as a mother and as a person who has lived a lot of life in your many young years, I will say. So without further ado, Laura, thank you for saying yes to this. And if you could give our audience just a minute, sort of the context in which you're coming to us today. So tell us a bit about you, through the lens of your professional life, but also through the lens of your personal life. And then we're going to dig right in.
Hi. Well, thank you for having me, Deb. I'm really excited to be here. I would categorize both my career and kind of my personal life in the terms of writing. I've always wanted to be a writer. I knew I was going to be a writer. I was a big book reader. I like grammar. I like the actual art of writing. And I just wasn't sure which industry would take me in. So I ended up in the legal industry, which is where my mother worked for the majority of her career. And I just kind of ended up loving it. I love the challenge. I love working with people, bit of an extrovert. So yeah, a lot of the last 20 years of my life has been dedicated to my career.
I love that. Well, in the professional context, I can say, having been on the receiving end, not only you are a phenomenal writer, but you know how to help other people be phenomenal writers. Tell us a little bit about just the function that you're playing in your current role and as a leader at your business. Tell us a little bit about what you do on a day-to-day basis. And then we're going to talk about what you know about what it means to be a successful professional. But first, a little bit more about what you do.
I would categorize, I'm kind of a Jill of all trades, I guess, because I tend to work in smaller departments. I focus on communications. And right now, my current role, I work with partners to JD Supra. So, consultants, and, sort of partner with them on marketing initiatives and referrals and that kind of thing. But I think traditionally it's been really in the digital marketing vein, writing, social media, advertising. I'm very good at taking an idea, a piece of content, and then rewriting it, reworking it to different mediums and different audiences. So I really like the challenge of, using one piece to then create 10 different ones. And, they sound completely different. They look different. So that's what I like to do.
Well, and it's such a widened purview because I often think about that spirit of writing as it's sort of in a singular space of I am an author or I write, but that relativity of adaptation so that the message of the story or the promotion can be expressed through those different media. And I've watched you and I've experienced it personally, how transformative it can be to take one piece of content and see it move. As somebody who is also really well regarded as a leader in your space and a bit of a change agent and a pioneer, and kind of thinking about our sort of professional norms of what like a successful career, a successful professional looks like, what have you learned or what have you seen on the arc of your journey professionally, and how we sometimes get caught up in the myths perhaps of what success could or should look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of people in the legal industry, there's one way up, and it's to CMO in a big law firm. And people talk about careers as being a ladder, which is upward trajectory. But I really believe in purpose and doing what you love. And at a certain point, I wasn't willing to give up certain things. And I think that sort of shocked people because I'm very ambitious. I like doing things. I like creating. I like innovation. But I ended up getting cancer a few years ago. And I think that solidified my viewpoint that, at the end of the day, it's not going to be my workplace. It's not going to be the culmination of what I, you know, wrote for the legal industry. It's really going to be my story and my legacy, which are my kids. And once you're faced with dying, I think that perspective really shifts, and quite clearly. You really know what you value in life very quickly.
You talked about that ladder, and I do see how quickly people can get caught in that sense of like striving. I think you described it to me once as like the title ladder, where the sense that you're making progress is in the sense that your job title keeps changing or elevating. And
Yes. Yeah,
when
that
you
you have to be responsible for more people when, I really I like my skill set. I like learning. I like, you know, growing with other people and not necessarily, doing that role, which I feel like sometimes it's very far removed from the actual art of marketing and, what you've been doing for most of your life. Just, kind of wasn't for me.
Totally. Well, I can't even imagine in the space of your life professionally and having this truly life-changing moment where perspective shifting, there's so much to be discussed now about, our brains to change perspectives and to see things with fresh eyes and the brutal facts. Could you share a bit more just about what that must have been like? And I know that it has a profound difference on like what does it mean to flourish in your professional context when you get that clarity of like what really 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 matters. I don't know that if people haven't been through that experience that maybe we haven't even considered different perspectives.
I mean, there was, I was diagnosed with stage 3B cancer. And that's it's getting to stage 4. And there was about, a couple weeks where I thought I had a spot on my lungs and that it had metastasized. And I think in those moments, you really, consider what it might be like if your, life was cut short. I actually just had a friend who I worked with for 8 years just passed away from ovarian cancer. In some ways it made my life more muddy. It's sort of, you're almost lost in the middle of a sea and you don't really know which way to go. But, my priority was my 2 kids. They were 5 and 7 when I was diagnosed. And, mom almost dying, almost not being there is, it changes our perspective too. And so, mom, why are you on your computer all the time? Why are you, and this was post pandemic. So I think a lot of us were working more and more and more, than we ever had. And it just, I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it mentally. Also, when you get that kind of diagnosis, I was 36 when I was diagnosed, and I'm in my early 40s now. And my body changes, your chemistry changes. I was diagnosed with autism and ADHD. So I think all those things converging at once was just a lot. And I realized that, I wasn't happy. I wasn't happy sacrificing the things that I'd been sacrificing for so long. And it does not make sense. Why would I don't know why I would punish myself and go through all of that without having it align somewhere with my purpose. If I was going to spend that much time away from my kids, then, it really has to be meaningful. And not to say that it's not. I mean, I love the legal industry and I love the people I work with, but it just was not hitting the right buttons anymore.
Yeah. Well, and I think, first of all, I want to just say specifically, I'm so sorry for your loss. And having been on that journey and then having to see, how things can play themselves out, it's like we don't have the luxury of this, like this all sense of time. We just don't. And yet I look at sometimes even in my own like blind spots, how quickly you can be consumed by things that really aren't the ultimate things. And understanding that and awakening to that is I know it's so powerful. And I've watched you and I've seen, that arc. Also being that young and your children, are still school age, if I'm not mistaken. Is that
Yeah.
correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So just that idea of like we have to remove those externalities that really in the end are not going to be the ultimate things. Say a bit more, you are a category of one. And what I love about the things that you've been so kind to share with me and now sharing with our audience is, not only are you, a cancer survivor, that you have diversity in your learning style, your presence, your brain is very unique and special. And you bring so much uniqueness to things in a way that when I think about human flourishing, I'm eager to learn. I'm eager to understand, what are some of the gifts that you experience in having so much diversity in your life, and what are some of the limits? Can you talk about that a bit?
I mean, I love diversity. I think just diversity in general is what makes the world go round. I mean, I love meeting new people. I love understanding and being open to new ideas and new perspectives. I've read a lot of dystopian novels in my life, and I hate the idea of everybody being the same and everybody thinking the same and reading the same things and watching the same things. I get joy out of meeting people who are different and listening to their stories. And I think having all of these things happen to me, which is not, not great. It's not things that you want. But at the same time, they become gifts for other people. Me suffering and writing about that suffering allows other people to feel like they're not alone.
I want to dig into that. I have had friends who've come through difficulties in life, and they're like, when you're in the acute phases of a diagnosis or an acute phase of crisis, there's a lot of engagement, a lot of like people are aware and they're showing up and they're, trying to be helpful. And then as the journey and the experience progresses, that sense of connection or that sense of how people show up. What are some observations that you've had in your own journey? And then I am going to ask for some practical advice, because I do think when we are met with people we care about who are having a hard time, it's how do you sustain the showing up and being connected. But what was that journey like for you? Because I can imagine being diagnosed with stage 3B, like you said, like we're not the options are like we got to get busy getting busy. But what was it like in the early stage, and then as you said, kind of as you've come through the journey and even now, what's that been like for you?
I think people in my journey, my personal journey, showed up when I was going through treatment and showed up in a really big way, I think. And I think most people understand cancer as treatment and not necessarily what it's like post cancer, which is, I think, where most of us end up struggling. Because treatment is an adrenaline rush. You are trying not to die. And that is what you're focused on, is getting through this so that you can, you have the opportunity for a life afterwards. But post cancer, I think, is when you're really coming to terms with what happened. And I was kind of in a unique place where I was both cancer free, but I had a second treatment that was really over treatment. And then after that, some of us end up with other health problems. It's triggered other health problems for me. And that's harder for people to understand. It was harder for people to understand, how could you now be cancer free and living and not be okay? It was just, and then there was a judgment there. And, at the same time, my ex was moving out. I was being a single parent. I had to file for bankruptcy because I couldn't afford the bills on a single salary. Then it was the move and, splitting up the dogs and all of the, just things that are really hard by themselves, let alone together. It was a struggle. And I think people's tolerance for my suffering was kind of at an end.
Yeah.
And that was difficult.
I, I even hearing you talk about it now, it's like I suspect there's that sense of, well, first of all, why do you think as human beings we're so uncomfortable with suffering? First of all, human flourishing and suffering, they don't occur independent of one another. And yet now you have a front row seat of like understanding what, like in many ways, what real suffering is like in an acute stage and then in a post-treatment phase. What is your sense about it? Like, why are we so, I don't know, why do we tire of it so quickly? Or why is there such a disconnect in your observations?
I mean, I think because it's suffering, and I especially with cancer, I think for caretakers and people who are really close to the person with cancer, it's already very difficult. So, why prolong it? Because they don't have to suffer. They really don't, and that's their choice. But, I don't get a choice. Um, a lot of these things happen to me and I did not cause them. So I think everybody has their limits and that is their prerogative. But most of us we don't want to be like that. We're going through something, we're in the middle of something and are really struggling. And if you don't have anybody around you that understands that, that's where you kind of get into trouble. You now feel bad for that suffering and then it becomes kind of a cyclical, like you just end up hating yourself. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was I didn't like me. And, I had spent so many years building that up and then here I am again. But, I think that's where having a voice and being able to share that with people so that they don't then get into that mindset that there's something wrong. I mean, there is, but not, you got to get through it. You can't just get cancer and then, all right, where's this wisdom at? Like, let me, bring it. I want it. And it's like, well, I don't know what to tell you. It took me a long time, I think, to get to a place where I could find meaning in that. If people had understood or I'd found people in that space, I would have gotten through it quicker, but that's just not what happened.
This wasn't part of your journey. Well, and now thinking about, I guess on a really practical level, if folks are hearing this right now, I would love to know really two things. The first thing is when people show up the way that is actually helpful, that would be great to sort of unpack. And then I do want to shift because I watch how you're moving and using these experiences in service to other people. That'll be the part two. But let's just in a really practical way, you know, when people either got it right or could have gotten it right, what is actually helpful when somebody's in the thick of it and it's protracted? It's not, can we flip the light switch? Isn't it over now? Say a little bit about that if you can.
I mean, I think, it kind of depends on what their own experience is. Like I said, I do think there's a line for people, and I think that that's completely fair to have, but then be upfront about that. Like,
Yeah.
Or help that person find resources. So for me, I would have loved somebody else. I would have loved organizations that I just wasn't aware of and just didn't think about. So right now, I'm actually a mentor for an organization called ABCD, and it stands for After Breast Cancer Diagnosis. They do this like big questionnaire, and then they pair you with people
Okay.
that are most similar into whatever information you're looking for. So I tend to talk to a lot of newly diagnosed women who either have kids because I had kids or like, the type of cancer that I had or, just whatever space they're in, they're looking for somebody else to talk to. So that's what I do. I get on the phone and we talk about stuff and share each other's, what has happened and what happened to me. And I think that is helpful because
Yeah.
it shouldn't be on the burden of just people in your life because again it's a really hard thing and I understand that, but can we, what other help can you get that person?
Yeah.
I think is really important because you don't know until you know.
Yeah.
And I feel like if we share those things that only helps, that information is only more readily available.
That's powerful. I'll make sure we include ABCD. You said I'll make sure we include that in the show
Yeah,
notes.
there's a lot of good organizations, but that's the one I'm volunteering with right now.
I love that. I also appreciate the candor. I would not have thought about how valuable it might be to be upfront with a person with regards to your limits, if there's a desire to be helpful, but also to be able to be clear, and that the way of creating support isn't always just the individual with time. How can they be an advocate or a resourcer in a way that can solve for different things, so that there is a way to come around someone within a wide range of time investments, emotional investments, physical or monetary investments. Like, there's a lot of different ways, which I think is so important for people to hear and to take away, and not to be so limited in thinking about what
Yes.
support
I
looks
think
like.
people tried to shield me from a lot of things when like it just made me feel more it just made me feel more different or isolated, that this wasn't a normal relationship then. Like I don't think I understood what was going on because nobody was telling me, when normally outside of cancer, that probably would have been what had happened. So, we're still people at the end of the day. We might be going through a lot, but like we still, I think we still have the same expectations that we did before.
Yeah. Well, as I'm imagining, and again, as I can see, one of the insights you shared with me is that, because you have this diversity in your life, and you've had experiential diversity, you've got your own personal diversity in the ways that allow you to kind of seek those out that are really different. Talk a little bit about, when you are approaching community, whether it can be professional or personal, what are some of the ways that you are able to bring this uniqueness that you possess in service to other people?
Kind of depends on the situation. I'm Mexican. I was born brown. And so I think I gravitate towards a lot of women of color and, people that have both visible and invisible diversities. I think I try to be really curious. I love working in a room. I love meeting new people, and I'm not afraid to sort of put myself out there. I try to go out of my way to proactively sort of share with people so that then they feel comfortable in sharing their own whatever it is. Because otherwise it's, you try not to profile or like, stick things in, try to identify people. But I think if I come in with my own story and diversities, that then sort of opens the door for other people to sort of
That's
share
such
that.
a great that's such a good insight, because I remember a very poignant moment where you went first, and I was struggling with some things that weren't visible in it's a journey with one of my daughters, who was really coming through some mental health crises, and just feeling really disconnected and not being able to sort of process what was happening for her and how I could show up for her. And I'll never forget it. You were so free and open to give me insight into what have experienced, and some of the journey and struggles that you had. And it was like a warm safety blanket. Like, I just felt this sense of like, oh, I can be real right now. Like, I don't have to posture and try to be the consultant and the motivational speaker. I can just be like a whole human that is like in the Shawshank tunnel of, sewage, trying to make my way through. And all of a sudden it was like, there you were like, you opened the door and then jumped in with me. And I think that's impactful. And I would want people to take that away, is that, if you've gone through something and you now have the blessing of the wisdom that comes with it, there's power in going first. There's power in making it safe for people to just know that, listen, I could look at you from afar and be like, she's got it all together. Like, there's not a a crinkle in the armor. It's like all smooth and easy. And I just think there's a lot of impact of that. So when I want to say very publicly, that was a very poignant moment in permission. And it was like as if I needed more reasons to be like, I'm so obsessed with Laura Gutierrez. But it was, it was at another level, I'll just say. And then ever since that moment, that there's just been like a deep knowing that you have a knowing. Anyway, I don't mean to wax poetic, but I just, what do you say to what I'm saying? Because I think sometimes when we've been through things, we like want to hold it real close and be like, well, now
And
that's in the
yeah,
past, it's over now.
you absolutely can. And I do think that, those of us who can speak and are willing to speak or write or whatever medium that you end up putting it in, it ends up it is a gift to people, but it isn't for everybody, because I will say, having been this open and vocal, especially in our industry, that it doesn't necessarily get you, the role that you want, because, people have a certain perception of, the drama that you bring, or whatever you want to call it. But I'm willing to do that. And I'm willing to do that for people who can. And so, you know, if you're the type of person willing to do that, then yes, please be louder, be more vocal, but it isn't for everybody. It's really hard. I mean, I putting my cancer diagnosis out there and being so open about it, for one, I think people have taken that advice and actually used it. I think I've helped at least 3 women diagnose their own cancer, because, they were just so much more aware of what I had been through. And you would never know who they are, because they don't want to share that. And that's fine. But I think if somebody else who is starting to go through it, they would then be willing to disclose that to other people. So I think, I'm more at the top, and I'm more vocal and more visible, but there are people around there who I think, if the door is opened, will then, share. But if you don't know that people are going through this, you feel so lonely and isolated. It's a very hard thing.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It really is. And I think in, some of the norms, if we look at like what's the normal way we're supposed to do our life and how we're supposed to show up in the spaces, what a crock of crap, right? I mean,
Right.
it's like, really at this time, I can't wait. You know what I'm so hopeful for is I think about our children, and I think about, the lives that they're living into, and how less constrained they are about like a norm, what's normed or normal. They have the opportunity to be more authentic and more expressed in just as they are. That delights me. I do see though the friction and battle, particularly with people that are my generation. So when I look at Gen Xers and that kind of smush, we're that kind of boomer to X generationally, and then how X's are engaging with millennials, and then millennials with Z's, and Z's with A's, and it as it moves on. But I am hopeful. And what's curious to me too, and I really love to hear what your perspective is on this. I found that when I have been willing to acknowledge vulnerability, or I have been willing to acknowledge that hard things have happened, and that the persona of everything's good, positivity, and all that, right? And that to be able to say like, no, a lot of the positive things I feel, and a lot of that the hopefulness that I have right now isn't born out of everything went my way. It's actually been born out of this conscious recognition that people go through stuff. And it's through that suffering or through that hard stuff that we become more rooted in the things that we find positive, or the more rooted in love, maybe.
Yeah.
I'm curious to see what you think about that too.
I mean, right, you have to have good with the bad and light with the dark, and, whatever balance that ends up is always a balance. You're never going to be completely positive, because it's so hard to appreciate things, I think, if you know that they're always going to be there. Especially if your life is very dark and you're going through a lot of things at once, you have to find something. You have to find something to cling to, because otherwise it's really easy to sort of get stuck and stay stuck. So, I think part of resilience and surviving is having moments of levity and joy, and finding those things amidst whatever you're going through.
It's true. And there's a conscious seeking. You have to
Yes.
prioritize
Yes, you do. Yeah.
looking otherwise. Well, I know I'm going to shift a bit, because you have many things that I think are interesting, and some of the things that bring you joy. And I think it would be fun for our audience to know about the hobby you shared with me that I think is wild, because I don't have this experience, but I know that you do. Can you talk about your chronicling and knowledge around the genre of horror movies, literature? Tell us about that, because I find that so fascinating, and yet I know that this is a really cool thing that you know a lot about. So can you tell us about that?
Well, I have a lot of, being autistic, you tend to have a lot of, people call them special interests. Edgar Allan Poe is actually my first anthology, and it's right there, my little green thing. My parents just had a huge library. They're both very well educated and they both kind of dealt with words in their careers. And I loved reading from an early age and was writing mystery novels. And it's continued to this day into movies. And I love cataloging. I love databases. I love building things. So I ended up building a horror movie website where I sort of review them, rate them based on scariness and gore and tension, and then trigger warnings, and it sort of spits out a score for you. I just have these weird ideas that, I want to then go do it and build, and it's fun. It brings you joy. And then it also has the dual benefit of me learning things. It was, me vibe coding and learning Claude and, building algorithms and tests and things. So it also, I think, it's completely separate from my career, but in a way not, because I am learning things that I can then translate to something else. So I my whole life, I think, has been learning and growing. I don't like staying steady. I want to keep learning things and sharing things. And that's, a big motivation for me.
Well, and this is just another creative way. So I want to make sure that we're going to include that also in the show notes for those who may be listening. Just the idea that it could give perspective, on that particular genre of a film. I also love in the you're giving me some language. So when people are diagnosed with autism, they call that a special interest, and I can see the joy.
Sometimes, yeah.
Sometimes
People don't always like that term, but it's just, we get very obsessed with things, and you just know everything about it. So I know everything about horror movies, and I read horror books. Technology tools is another one. Pens and paper. I'm obsessed with fountain pens and inks and paper and handwriting, and I love dogs. I've always loved dogs. I used to be able to. I can look at them and kind of guess at their breed, and so then post cancer, one of the things that I love to do was fostering dogs, and
it's powerful. See, but this is the stuff, Laura. This is a gift, and I am so glad that the HX Collective community now has an ability to know you, and you stand for so many things that I feel is, if we're not careful, we will miss. That people are whole human beings. We have our whole arc in life experiences, and what makes us sometimes unique and different are the things that can be enriching to others if we're curious. And so I'm so happy that you shared some of the additional things about you, which incidentally is going to require us to have some sidebar conversations, because I too have like certain things that are just, they're so tactile and tangible. So I want to learn more about, particularly around the paper and pens. I've got a bit of a stash. There may be more kindred spirit than I may know right now with you on this front. So I love that. As we look ahead, one of the commitments that I have in this podcast is that my guests really stand to be great teachers, that they're sharing wisdom and perspective. And I always love to be able to say, actionable things like how can a person learn from what you've learned? How can a person live a piece of the things that make, or draw some inspiration from what you've lived? And particularly in bringing more humanity to our life and our spaces, whether that's through the lens of work, whether it's the lens of relationships, whether it's the lens of our own self journey. What are some practical things that, if I'm listening to you and I want to take an action to be maybe more supportive to somebody who is struggling, or if I'm listening and I want to have permission to shift perspective on what matters a lot in our career trajectory, the alternative to a laddering, what's some practical advice you would give me as a listener?
I mean, I think looking to younger generations, and every new generation I feel, that comes into the workplace gets a lot of crap because, it's not the same work ethic, or millennials were known to be these flaky, fickle employees because we were moving companies, but it was to prove a point. This is not a sustainable lifestyle for me. So I need to be able to move, or you're treating me like this. And that is not okay. So we were willing to stick our necks out and move and make those changes. But, looking at the generation after, like what can we learn from what they're doing? I go back to being curious, ask questions. Why are you the way this is? Why are you making that decision? Let me sort of, dig underneath of the surface level of what you're seeing in the actual actions, but like, let me get deeper to understand really where you're coming from and why you're making that decision and why this is important to you. So, getting outside your own box. I think, especially being autistic and people trying to force me to be a particular way, it's just not, you can't be like that. You can't have those expectations of people. And so then the next thing that you can do is try to understand it. Because your role may not be, you don't need to support somebody, but you can try to understand why they're going through that and learn something from it.
Sure. I think that's it. I think that's the superpower, curiosity.
Yes.
And I think, and as we are stepping into a very disrupted era where a lot of the thinking, the cognition, if you will, is it can be, if we're not mindful, can be outsourced with an AI agent being the thinker for us and maybe removing our curiosity when we're in the human to human experiences. And so that's such an important takeaway. And I hope people will ask themselves, one, who am I around and what don't I know about them? How can I lean in and really understand a person's story? If I experience somebody who seems different or odd to me, instead of creating a first reaction of they're not my people or rejection, how do I get curious to know what's the backstory? Where have you come from? What have you lived or experienced? I'm taking away, I want to know more of where people's obsessions and passions are. I've learned even stuff about you today that I didn't know prior, which it is also very illuminating in a very real-time kind of way. People are really fascinating if we exercise the superpower of curiosity. And I think that's what we can't lose. If we want to elevate human flourishing in the world in any lens, curiosity is the through line, is what I'm grabbing from you.
I think even, I've got kids. I have young kids. They're 9 and 11 now, and living life through their lens is such an eye opener. Sometimes it's like a lot of what we're talking about is the leading by example of just, I'm not necessarily explaining it to anybody, but I'm living my life in a particular way that is easy to see is a little bit different. But that, even if I don't talk to them directly, that gives them an impression that they can do that as well. It's like having, I can't tell my kids what to do, but if I live that life, they then pick it up. As a parent, like, you really have to live it. You cannot tell them, you cannot explain to people, but you have to live it yourself. And I think that's really where people are getting it from. Not necessarily all the things that I'm saying, because I think you can interpret and misinterpret, but the actual way that people are living is what people pick up.
So I love what you're saying about how, particularly as a parent, that it's not what we say. It's like, I'll tell you what you think by the way that you act. And I do often get the sense that we may miss that, particularly when we have a hierarchy of do as I say, not as I do type principles as parents. But as we wrap up today, I want to reflect out loud again some of the important takeaways and why this conversation has been so meaningful to me. One, I just want folks that are listening to recognize suffering and having that lived experience. I think that we both, one, we need to normalize the emotion and the human experience that comes with that. I think secondly, if we have people in our lives that have been through something, particularly the cancer journey is such a poignant one that we have to continue to be curious and to acknowledge that just because a person's body is cancer free doesn't mean that the experience of vulnerability and suffering is over. And I'm reminded about that in a way that makes me want to show up and check in with people where I may have too quickly just said, oh, well, that's a nice end of chapter, next. I really love this construct of curiosity. And I think more should be said about what that means and what that looks like to lean into understanding a person's story or being fascinated by the things that may make them occur for you as distinct or different, and just really wanting to know that. And then have more friends like Laura Gutierrez who have really cool insights and passions so that your lives can be enriched and have more people and be that person who may have a willingness to go first, because I can say safety is accessible when you allow people know you've been through something, and you've given us that gift today. Any closing thoughts or advice for you as folks are listening and we're signing off for today? Any closing thoughts?
Don't be afraid to get it wrong. I think we spend a lot of time in our own minds asking ourselves, is this the right thing? And sometimes you just need to fucking do it and apologize later. So pronouns. I've had one person in the number of years I've had she, they on my, name tags has actually asked me what that means. Can I ask you what that means? And, it's okay to get it wrong. You're supposed to get better. How else do you learn other than making mistakes? So yeah, do not be afraid to misstep, because those are usually where you find sort of the nuggets of wisdom, I think.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, friend. I can't wait to see you soon, and I can't wait for our next conversation. For all of you, until next time, thanks for listening. Thanks for being here. If today's conversation sparked something in you, we hope you'll carry it forward with curiosity, compassion, and courage. Subscribe to the show, leave a review, and share this episode with someone who needs it. Until next time, keep exploring what it means to be fully human.